as of now, and will be available for download in typically about 36 hours once that is finished processing. All participants have been muted initially due to audience size, and we ask that you do maintain that mute on your microphone as well as turning off your camera so that we can concentrate on Dr. Scott. And handouts, a copy of today's slides will be distributed by email after today's presentation. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce your co-host, Dr. Douglas Reeves, founder of Creative Leadership Solutions. Dr. Reeves is the author of more than 40 books and over 100 articles on leadership and education. He has twice been named to the Harvard University Distinguished Authors Series and was named the Brock International Laureate for his contributions to education. His career of work in professional learning led to the contribution to the Field Award from the National Staff Development Council, which is now known as Learning Forward. Doug has worked in 50 states and more than 40 countries. His volunteer activities include finishing the dissertation, providing free and non-commercial support for doctoral students, and the Snafu Review, publishing the essays, poetry stories, and artwork of disabled veterans. Doug and his family live in downtown Boston. He tweets at Douglas Reeves, blogs at creativeleadership.net, and may be reached at area code 781-710-9633. Doug.
Well, good afternoon, friends. We're so delighted to have you here. For those of you listening to this broadcast later on, we're broadcasting in June of 2020. And as you can imagine, things are changing on a day-to-day basis, but we're very happy to bring you the latest and best ideas and evidence on equity. I'm especially pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Stacy Scott. Dr. Scott is the author of Making Equity Work, is the distributor of equity ideas around the globe, internationally known throughout the United States as well as in China for his work on differentiated instruction, leadership, and most particularly equity, which is our focus for today. Dr. Scott has led equity efforts at both Harvard University and Boston University. He's a veteran urban superintendent, and most importantly, brings a wealth of insight into how we can today make strategic planning work through an equity lens. Dr. Scott, welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reeves. Welcome, everyone. So glad to have you this afternoon. We're going to take a little bit of time to talk about equity and particularly strategic planning with an equity lens. I'm going to take my time and kind of walk you through a variety of issues with respect to how to think about equity when it comes to looking at setting your districts up for success with respect to equity. You will see that this is part of a three-part series. And the first part is equity proficiency training, where we sort of do basic cultural competency training. And then it's managing culture with an equity lens. And then this third part is around thinking about how to plan for strategic initiatives within your district. So that three-part series is a major part of what we do to try to support and provision districts to be able to build their capacities as districts. Our interest is to build their cultural capacity, their management capacity, their planning capacity, so ultimately they can feel effective with respect to equity overall. In terms of the certification training that we provide, it's ultimately about thinking about how we change the design, the structure, the function of our schools and our districts to get to higher levels of student learning, but also to think about how we think about the change dynamics and the complexities that we have to manage when it comes to managing large urban systems. How do we support equity so that the change strategies that we create can actually improve teaching and learning? What does it take to make equity a reality? You'll notice in this particular workshop, some of the essential elements are that we define and we analyze what equity is. We talk about developmental stages for equity so that you can map your journey. We talk about proficiency assessments for individuals and for organizations, and what are the critical qualities for leadership? What are the systemic levers that we need to be thinking about as we manage change, and how do we meet the needs of every stakeholder in our equity processes? I don't have time to do all those today, but I'm going to give you some highlights that allow you to see what we're thinking about when we think about building skills to change school culture. We think about a variety of ways in which we need to not only manage change, but we need to lead change. My sense of the greatest contribution that we can give to our children in our schools is a well-run system. A well-run system ultimately won't need equity initiatives if it's balancing its resources effectively to help all students reach the appropriate targets that we set for them. But because our systems are plagued with bias and with other challenges, we have to build cultural competency. We need to understand how do we assess the culture in ways that allows us to speak to the equity issues, and also how do we check our equity lens. And it's about these core competencies. Certainly we can think about how needed these are for our society at this particular moment. When we stand in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and so many others, we're trying to figure out how do we build the capacity to go to the underlying equity issues within our society and to provision our society, even the next generation, so that we don't have to deal with these on a day-to-day basis. As I get you started today, I would ask you to think about what does it take for us to create sustainable education systems that afford every child access to high quality education. This is an example of the kind of transformational question that we're needing to look at in our society as a whole, as we think about justice reform, as we think about reforming healthcare, as we think about our society in a general sense. What is it that our systems need? Many of you are in different systems around the country. You are coming in with a variety of different needs and concerns. You need to be thinking about what does your system need to provide high quality education to every student within the system. We always have to define equity in these conversations to make sure we're talking about the same thing. With respect to educational equity, what I'm talking about is a lack of proficiency that some have for meeting the needs of the future economy. And what does it take for us to be able to make sure that we provision the systems to give them what they need? Is it about opportunity? Is it about achievement? Is it about performance gaps? Or is it indeed about all of those things and what we do to make sure that our students have the appropriate opportunity to meet the achievement levels that we want to set for them and to do the levels of performance that we know that they are capable of? Is equity, or actually the inequity within our systems, does it just harm those who are on the underside of the equation, or does it seem to also harm those who potentially are doing well? I think equity ultimately is a question for everyone. That inequity in our system harms both the victim as well as it does the perpetrator, because it diminishes all of our capacity as a society to be as effective as we need to be. So equity is really about everyone. It's about meeting the needs of the entire society. We often have to clarify that this is different than simply a diversity issue, or even just broadly speaking, an inclusion issue. Diversity is sort of about kind of who's at the party, is everybody there who you want to be there, and is it representing a broad range of different kinds of people? Is it about inclusion, which might be that people are actually included in the planning of the party and they feel sort of connected to what's happening? Or even beyond that, is it about who is actually deciding whether to have a party and power to influence who's invited to the party? And equity redistributes that power. It ultimately gets to the core issues that need to be addressed in terms of fairness in the procedures and the processes and practices that we use to distribute resources within our systems, within our society. And ultimately the disparities that we see that are ultimately sort of represented in the historical underrepresented populations that are underperforming, those get eliminated when we deal with equity effectively. So equity requires changing the structures, particularly the structures that relate to the power and privilege within our society, that ultimately make it so that some can reach their goals and others may not. So in order to talk effectively about equity, we have to talk about leadership and how we provision leaders to be able to effectively support districts to be able to be equitable districts. A leader in a system has to ultimately be able to articulate a vision that includes equitable treatment of all and reaching of goals for all within that organization or society, communicating the goals so that their team is able to embrace those goals and meet those goals. Goals that involve high performance expectations for all concerned and ways to strengthen the curriculum with the kind of rigor and the quality of instruction that causes students to be able to reach those outcomes. And what does it take to make sure that every stakeholder in the community ultimately is able to contribute to the processes of equity involved? Well, a leader has to make that possible. Characteristics of such a leader involve that they have to be developing themselves on a variety of different continua. Their personal development has to be one about building cultural competency, understanding equity issues and their impact on those within their system. They have to be visionary, as I've mentioned. They have to understand instruction and what culturally relevant instruction is. They have to use a critical lens in order to be able to determine when, in fact, the curriculum is supportive of the development of everyone in the system and when it potentially can be damaging. Organizational development, as well as stakeholder development, have to be ways in which the leader is skilled to be able to move the organization as a whole forward, and to be able to make sure that all the critical stakeholders see their place in the work. So I open with this question to ask you, what are your strengths and your areas of growth in terms of equity? This workshop is designed to help you to think about what are the ways in which you are growing yourself. What's your growth edge in terms of the issues of equity? Are you working on operationalizing it? Are you worrying about envisioning new ways of thinking about transformation within systems? Are you working on moving your staff forward? And what are the strategies for being able to create that kind of group process? Each of us has to sort of know our own area of growth so that we can reach out for the support that we need. When we think about an improvement cycle, whether it's for the individual or the organization, we think about the need to cover these 4 steps in what we call the equity cycle: reviewing and envisioning, analyzing inequity, being able to plan for equitable outcomes, and then also being able to implement a strategy. This is what is going to be able to help you to be able to meet the priority areas for improvement within your system. So if I start with the issue of reviewing, part of the issue here is being able to do an analysis of your system, an environmental scan that allows you to begin with answering questions about what is effective instruction as we define it. What would an equitable system look like in my city or town? What are the requirements for high equity performance where I live? And what would high quality instruction look like at its core in my district? So that equity sort of scan, that environmental scan, allows you to be able to begin to answer questions like where are we as a system and what do we need to do to go forward? It allows you to consider basic strategies, like if we're working in the area of human capital, you might be thinking about what are the initial areas in which we might build reform? What are the ways in which we might begin shifting our leadership structure so that they are more inclusive and more collaborative? What are the ways in which we set expectation for our staff in such a way that they're able to, in fact, potentially create more high expectations for their staff and for the students? Do our union contracts, in fact, kind of uplift our teaching staff and our general staff in ways that cause them to feel included in the process, or are they exclusionary? Are we building collaborative relationships with all of the employee groups in ways that makes them feel like they're a real partner? And that's real equity. Are we creating a systemic approach to the pipelines that we're creating for building human capital? Do we have professional development systems that ultimately have equity at their core? Everybody is giving input into what they need for their professional development. They perhaps are the ones doing their own professional development. They're empowered to be able to grow themselves as a system. So that's examples of elements of an equitable system, just looking at one particular area like human capital. And ultimately, in any such area that we might focus on, the goal is to institutionalize a systemic approach that allows us to be able to drive equitable outcomes in that particular area. So if we were looking at the area of instructional core as another example, we would think about how are we defining the common standards and the expectations for rigor? Are they evenly applied across all people groups, across all sort of areas of challenge for the district? Are our English language learners challenged in the same way in which we're challenging our gifted and talented students? And does rigor apply to everyone? Or are there ways in which somehow some are exempted in the way that their tracks are managed? Their student assignment never allows them to get to the more rigorous work. Do we build ownership from the teachers and full buy-in so that they feel like it's their system? They are designing the instructional mechanisms that are causing students to be excited about learning and to be fully engaged. Are there common resources? Are we using the high leverage instructional strategies that really will drive key learning? When I walk into classrooms, I'm spending some time, I'll leave the state and the classroom, the city out for the moment, walking into classrooms as I visit classrooms and watching teachers sort of kind of hammering students on why aren't your worksheets done? I'm giving you lots of time to do these worksheets. That's what we're here for. You didn't do them for homework, so that's why we're doing them now in class. And I want to pull what little hair I have out because I'm realizing that these students, wouldn't naturally be captivated by the prospect of yet again filling out another worksheet. So what does it mean for them to get engaged in something that really grabs their imagination, grabs their mind, and makes them feel excited about the learning opportunity? So we want to align our professional development with that curriculum in a way that is causing teachers to have time to build the quality curriculum that allows students to do project-based learning, that allows them to do culturally relevant learning that brings it home to them in terms of who they are. and then making sure that they have assessment mechanisms that really reinforce the priorities that they've set for their instruction. So those are ways of thinking about how an equity sort of analysis would in fact cause different ways of thinking about our processes. Ultimately, we have to do an equity systems analysis. The initial environmental scan will kind of tell us where are we generally speaking, but an equity analysis will help us to answer the question of what is it going to take to produce better outcomes? Do we need to fully redesign certain systems to move more effectively? In order to manage the change dynamics within the system, do we have to use systems thinking in order to be able to, in fact, create a system that aligns all of the key functions that are designed to improve teaching and learning at its core? That's what a system needs to be doing. When you think about another area, like what does it take to create access and support within the system, one might begin thinking about the need to ensure that all students are ready for college and the global economy. And what does that look like? What does that take to evolve our standards to the place where every student sees their future, is engaging in real work-related activities in school and out of school so that they are preparing for the future beyond the classroom? Do we really give principals the power that they need to be able to support teaching and learning within the school in an effective way? Have we aligned our expectations for our teachers with effective instructional strategies so that we've given them the coaching and the professional developments and the guidance that they need to reach their dream, which is to be exciting and effective teachers in the classroom? Are we creating motivation for students around high expectations and making sure that the funding is necessary for them to reach their challenging targets? What does it take for us to provision a system to move in that direction, to make sure that high quality education is provided for all children? So that's what reviewing and envisioning equity really looks like. From this point, one really has to begin looking at inequity within the system to understand what are the inequities, the performance challenges that you may have to address within your system to be able to effectively move forward on a plan to implement for equity. Well, sources of inequity can come in all shapes and sizes, as I'm sure you know. And here are some of the usual suspects. You want to look at resource distribution in particular and think about where are qualified teachers and our qualified principals. What are the funding issues within the system in terms of where we're having difficulty getting funding to difficult problems that we're having trouble solving? Are the facilities for those that are the least of these within the system? Often it's the English language learners or the special ed. Are they pushed into the back? Are they given fewer teachers? Are they tracked on lower tracks in such a way that they cannot achieve at high levels within the system? And believe me, I've seen all kinds of similar arrangements like that where those who are the least thought of in the system are given less resources. So unfortunately, it happens all too often still around the country. And so how do we make sure that those intervention programs really are in fact special programming that allows students to be able to get help to reach their objectives? Do we set expectations that actually put our policy and practice into place where our policy is about high performance for all students, that our practice is about challenging everyone to reach higher levels? Do we see those special populations as those with special opportunities to even do better because we give them the resources and the tools necessary to be able to do that? I like to think about the challenges with respect to dismantling racism in a few different critical ways. The part of the challenge is to be able to think about the different ways in which we look at the problems within our systems. From an ideological perspective, we're kind of looking at the underlying development of racism and oppression within our system. And it's kind of like the water that we drink. We drink it in on a regular basis. And in fact, it really becomes a shared meaning-making source from which we understand the nature of our society. Institutionally, it's more like the water that is made for us to drink. So how the institutions within our system reinforce and manifest the underlying ideologies. So right now, for our society, the challenge is that institutionally, we're looking at sort of the norms that are set for policing within our society that we recognize clearly need to be changed. because what's in the water that we're drinking are some racist notions about how some people need to be managed and controlled in ways that makes it perfectly okay to create a police state in certain communities. Well, what does it look like in the individual interactions between people? Well, we play out oppressive notions upon each other at the interpersonal level because of what's deeper down within us, and it simply comes out in those interpersonal moments. And finally, that we see racism when it's ultimately internalized, because we're all sort of in the society, we're all drinking the water, and our challenge is to manage it because we're all vulnerable to it. We have to manage that in a way that allows us to be able to not act upon deeper ideologies that may in fact be dysfunctional within our society. I should stop here for a moment. Tony, let me ask if there's anything in the chat that would be important to respond to.
Well, I have encouraged folks to send in comments, Dr. Scott. However, I think it is important that you have folks, at least geographical diversity is represented from Massachusetts to Texas to California to Washington State, and a variety of roles across the spectrum, from classroom robotics teacher to state educational consultant.
Excellent, excellent. Nice to have that diversity. I think that it makes me think about how important it is for us to think about equity from the classroom, specifically as we design curriculum, both with respect to the sciences and other areas, as well as how do we think about the systems that we're managing at the state level and at various association levels, because there we have the capacity to drive conversations about what the future will look like.
And a principal from Ontario, Canada.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent. That's good to have that diversity. I think it makes me think about one of the projects that I'm involved in is doing STEM camps in Nigeria in the summertime. And part of the challenge, of course, is recognizing that if we want the next generation of young people to be ready to lead us to solve some of the global problems that we're facing, we need to bring to them learning opportunities that really give them the tools to be able to think through what is it going to take to understand the contemporary problems that we're facing and find solutions to them for the future. And that is a real equity issue because the problems that the global community is creating are often rolling downhill upon those who have maybe the least resources at the moment to solve the problems. We need to do something about that.
Dr. Scott, I want to go back to something that you said earlier about the need for helping students catch up and also the need to challenge them for the most advanced courses. I've listened as recently as this morning to teachers and educational leaders really struggle with this. On the one hand, we know that disadvantaged students fell behind the worst during COVID-19 and during the summer, and so they need extra help to catch up. On the other hand, if all we do is focus on catching up, they never have opportunities for advanced work. How do you help schools balance that need for meeting students with the needs to catch up and also giving them opportunities for advanced work?
So I think that what's important for schools to do is to make sure they understand what the core standards are. We used to call the power standards, those things that are at the core of the curriculum from grade to grade, so that they're able to make sure that students have the most important things that they need to move from grade to grade. Because a lot of what we do provide for our students is added value to those core elements. But when students need to accelerate and do more than a year's work within a year, we often need to really stay focused on those critical skills that they need to learn. I suggest that what is most helpful is to be able to go to challenging project-based learning that stretches students. If they have deficits in their basic fund of information, the challenge of that project is going to force them to go figure things out, to go to the additional tutoring sessions or to go online and get a web tutoring experience around the particular task or skill that they didn't learn, force them to recognize the need to accelerate their own development. But the project will allow students who are at different levels of achievement to engage with a team in particular around wrestling with the issue. How do we solve this problem? What do we bring from our varying perspectives? Our challenge is to get students to think critically about these issues. And if they have deficit skills because they are behind, then the project challenges them to be able to go and figure out where to go to get what they need. One of my favorite schools that I visited recently was the Salt Lake Innovation High School. And in this school, students don't have to actually go to the regular classes. They punch in the daytime with their punch card, and they can sign up for lectures during the day that they need, because they know that as they work through the online curriculum, they may need some additional assistance in a particular area, but they choose the classes that they want to go to based upon their understanding of what they need to be able to keep moving in the curriculum. So they're able to manage their own development if given the keys to their own process. So I think if we engage them in real world experiences, they will push and take the tutoring and the remedial opportunities we need to present to them to accelerate, so we're not constantly trying to remediate for them.
And Dr. Scott, Pamela suggested the use of personalized learning models, and Phoebe reacted with student agency to your comments.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going back in the chat, so I'm not reading the ones coming in. That's very helpful, thank you. You know, some of my friends are in the Cleveland system in Ohio, and if you're following them on the news, or you might want to just go and sort of check what they're doing in terms of mastery learning, I'm so excited that there are increasingly good examples of school districts that are doing mastery level learning. So they're beginning to retrofit their systems to move away from standardized grading that we've done before, like we've done for so many years, move to project-based learning, move to mastery-oriented learning, so that it doesn't matter that students may be at different places over time. The teacher's there to facilitate each of them in their learning along the continuum of the standards to the point where they're able to hit the challenging targets that they have for them. So it's exciting that that's happening more increasingly around the country. We certainly need for that to be happening all over the place. I love the diversity of folks that are in there as I look at your chats from all over. That's wonderful. Other questions? Anything else that I can respond to before I move on?
Not at this time, but ladies and gentlemen, please send those questions and comments in through the chat feature. We will make sure Dr. Scott sees those.
Do that. I want to move and talk about some very specific kind of ways to contextualize the inequity within systems, and do that as a way of talking about how do we look into our systems and see the inequity as we are doing this initial analysis. What are some of the ways in which we can look into our systems and begin to explore the areas that may be in need of work in terms of equity? And then, of course, the latter parts of this workshop, I may not get to today, talk about the actual strategic planning process that we do use to build a plan in response to some of these issues. So one thing to sometimes look for in terms of inequity within districts is to determine whether or not the system has defined exactly what does it mean and how much would it cost to provide adequate education to each of the members of the subgroups, stakeholder groups within the system. Have we actually articulated the additional resources that might be necessary to really fully fund, let's say, what English language learners need within the district? English learners often need some additional resources. In Massachusetts, for example, we have state laws that require that districts bring on additional supports, provide additional programming for students, but many of our schools don't do it. In many respects, they would say we don't have the funds necessary to provision our schools with the coaches, with the paras, with the additional supports that would be necessary to have the right classrooms and to integrate students when they're going to full inclusion. We don't have the resources necessary to do that. It's important to be able to first articulate what should it look like, and then to be able to see in what ways is our system falling short of that, and what would it take for us to in fact then move in that direction. That's a conversation you have to have with the community at large, so that the community is able to consider what will it take to move the system forward in a fully equitable way. Another example would be to think about the kinds of standards that are being created in the system. What are the indicators and the standards being used to determine the nature of whether there are disparities? Is there equitable access within the system? Do students have the capacity to get to the high-level courses in the district, or do some students, by virtue of the fact that they may come behind, they may get behind over time, never get the chance to catch up to do the higher level courses by the time they should be finishing high school? What does that mean? And what would it mean to change the system so that students had acceleration opportunities to leapfrog and catch up and to be able to do the more challenging work? The benefit of the more challenging work is that it stretches them intellectually. In math, for example, is a language. Math is a logical language. And as students develop, their capacity to do that logical thinking increases. But if they haven't been given the basics, then they can always be kept at developmentally at a lower level of cognition and math skill than they're developmentally ready for. So what does it take to deal with the fact that they may have had some deficits in the past, but they could in fact operate on a logic level that's much higher than their current math skills? That's a problem that a good math teacher can solve if the system doesn't get in their way and prohibit them from accelerating students. So is there equitable access opportunities within the system? Are the structural limitations actually being challenged? Do we prepare our teachers with the professional development that would help them to even understand what I just said? So for example, the notion of acceleration is one we haven't spent as much time on in our society as we need to. I'm really excited that the new commissioner we have in Massachusetts has a career in creating acceleration academies, and it's become one of his signature initiatives here in the state of Massachusetts. The notion that in specialized weekend courses, summer courses, opportunities with specific classrooms, students can be accelerated so that they can catch up and not always be behind, that they can identify what the core elements in the curriculum are and they can accomplish those so they can perform at a higher level. That's really critical information that we've been working on for a while as a society, but we have not been able to make it move broadly across the society, which we need to do. So professional development can create the capacity to do that. Do we build systems that have the capacity to use the data that exists to be able to drive change? I remember being in Montgomery County, Maryland, and I was the associate superintendent for accountability, shared accountability as we called it. And my responsibility was producing all of the research reports that were being used in what we call the MSTAT meetings. These were our data meetings that were causing very effective conversations about, is this system in fact doing all that it can do to increase access and opportunity for students that are traditionally left out of the more rigorous courses? And what would it take for us to be able to help more students to effectively get into those honor courses, those AV courses? So Dr. Lacey, the deputy superintendent, created what she called the habit tool, honors and AP identification tool, and students were identified as being capable of performing in the higher level, but because it's about teacher recommendation and grades and things that weren't necessarily the best indicators of whether or not a student could succeed at the higher level, these students were analyzed and given opportunity to perform in those higher classes, and they were able to be successful. It increased their ability to take AP tests, which saves you money in college. It increased their experience of those higher level courses, which again increases your ability to stay in college and graduate. It was an impressive use of data to drive change within the system. Do our systems have the capacity to use data in that way? Is there an alignment between the pre-service and the professional development that helps teachers to be able to get the feedback that they need and formative evaluations to help them to grow? Do we do the same thing for students in ways that causes them to be able to, when they're not moving, to get what they need to grow? It has to be there both for the adults as well as for the students.
And Dr. Scott, a question from Timothy as you were discussing data and giving that example. Are there other data points that you would suggest that we monitor to check for a lack of equity?
So absolutely. I think that monitoring student placement, student assignment is a critical one. I think that looking at where our dollars are spent, as I mentioned, is another critical one. Monitoring from a human capital perspective, the degree to which we are moving candidates of color into more challenging leadership opportunities is a critical one. I direct a program in the state of Massachusetts where we are essentially preparing future superintendents of color that 3 to 5 years from now could rise to the superintendent level in the state, because the numbers are 3-4% within the state are of color in a state where that's clearly an underrepresentation of the possibilities. So monitoring the degree to which our system is promoting from within or building through our paraprofessionals a pipeline to teachers with increased diversity, those are critical numbers that we can monitor. Monitoring student satisfaction around issues of cultural satisfaction with the culture. Are they able, cultural identity issues within the culture? Are they able to express themselves? Are they able to be themselves? Is there excessive bullying and discomfort in terms of their own identity issues within the system? So those are just examples, certainly, of things that you can monitor that give you an indication as to, is my system an equitable system or not? And do I need to intervene upon any of those critical areas in order to be able to be more effective?
One idea that you might just want to consider is that, as Stacy knows better than anybody, when it comes from an accountability standpoint, a lot of our traditional accountability indicators are all about effects. What we want to focus on also is on causes. So for example, if the effect we're trying to achieve is greater equity in enrollment in advanced placement classes, Oftentimes, that decision is made not as juniors in high schools, it's made in 4th and 5th grade. So identifying students entering middle school that are on track for advanced classes, that helps to identify equity and inequity at the very source.
Yeah, so you have to be able to track and do a systems analysis to track sort of, not right before kids are getting placed in the AP classes, but also really, as Doug is implying, tracking it all the way back to the potential root causes of the problem. And that really takes you to a very different level than you otherwise would.
And on this note of leadership, a question, Dr. Scott, how do you recruit candidates of color when there are minimal who apply for leadership positions?
So I think that you have to go out of your way to find candidates who you can put into your pipeline, that you have to, in fact, begin to go down to your student level, get them, create a cohort of students that are able to kind of potentially go on to college to study to become teachers. So you really begin really at the root. You really begin with thinking about how would you, in fact, build the next coterie, the next level of leaders in order to be effective. What do you need to do to really resource at HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities? What do you need to do to go into the communities that some of your students may be coming from to build the next generation of leaders? Hang on one second.
Interestingly, I would just add that the same has to do with recruiting women into leadership. I just finished an article on this where we know that 23% of superintendents are women. It's been stuck there for 20 years, and yet close to 80% of our faculty positions are women. And the antidote is not just pulling people out of thin air, but rather every month, do we have an equity indicator for our senior leaders? How many people did you have a career development discussion with? Not an evaluation or anything else, but sit down and say, you're doing a great job. Have you thought about leadership, or would you consider a leadership internship? I think it's up to us in senior leadership to reach out and have these career development opportunities and discussions early on in people's career.
So what we're doing in Massachusetts is we have what we call a kaleidoscope grant, which is a teacher diversity grant that allows schools to be able to engage in a process for building pipelines, paras to teachers, teachers to leadership positions, leaders to senior leaders, as I mentioned, to becoming superintendents. And that ends up becoming critical resources and cohorts, peer cohorts, to talk about these issues and make plans. Those end up being critical ways in which they're able to think through how to create that support. Finding peers that you can work with who are working on the same problem. We've created networks of district leaders to talk about these issues, and we provide them seminars on how to do planning for human capital development. They do strategic planning around equity, which allows them to put metrics into their plans to think about how to sort of change the future, since in the present they're limited in terms of their current diversity in their leadership ranks.
I think we've hit a hot topic here, Dr. Scott. From Linda, what would be some effective ways to encourage leaders that are already in place, from principals to superintendents, to really dig deep into this topic? She states that she is in a district that is focusing on culturally responsive teaching, which is a good approach, but she believes we can do more in the area of equity, dismantling racism, and building capacity.
So I think that getting people to consider the data that may show the lack of diversity in leadership can be really meaningful, because it can help people to sort of see that there are untapped challenge areas that need to be addressed.
Thanks, sir. You're welcome, sir.
And also it's possible for that data to show dissatisfaction, on the part of students or staff in terms of equity-related issues. And you want to kind of figure out, how do I get data that allow me to sort of make the point that there are needs that are going unmet, that there's dissatisfaction, and there are opportunities for growth. So, doing an audit in a particular department, curriculum, or whatever department you may have responsibility for, transportation or HR, can be a way to sort of raise a flag and say, there are some unmet needs here. And it'd be great if we could add attention to that. So you're basically trying to stir the stir the interest to go beyond instruction in the classroom, which is certainly important, to thinking about the fact that part of what causes people to not rise through the ranks is embedded in the culture. And then unless we deal with the norms and the culture that prevent people from moving through the ranks, that cause people to not have to challenge their hiring decisions, because we all hire people who we are comfortable with. We like them and they match our own personalities. So we would tend to hire them. So we have to challenge those notions. And that takes some training around cultural proficiency and getting comfortable with different cultures. And sometimes you can begin just by giving people exposure, creating opportunities for people to sort of challenge their own notions, their own comfort levels around diversity, and then using that as a bridge to beginning the conversations about, do we really think about the structures that drive inequity? People have to be willing to be uncomfortable enough to address those issues. And it can be difficult. One of my family members works at UNH, and he's described as a conversation that they're having at UNH. So are there things that we do, are there behaviors that we do that are potentially supportive of racism? My response back to my good brother was, it's not just enough to look at the behaviors. That's great. And it'd be great if it's nice for us to all be nice to each other. But let's look at the structures that actually are exclusionary, or the structures that actually cause us to act the way we act, that makes it okay for the police to do what they do, or that makes it okay for us to use our funds in the way in which we do. If we actually were willing to commit to a social justice institution, what would that look like? Can we answer that question? If we were to commit to understanding our own culture, all of us, well, what is white culture? What is Black culture? And sharing that authentically, we would have more powerful connectivity with each other, and we'd be able to think through some of these issues in a different way.
And one more question. To what extent does school leadership hierarchy structures perpetuate inequities? What research do you know of that analyzes alternatives in school leadership?
I'm terrible with sort of research off the top of my head, although Doug, you're much better at pulling studies. But one of the things that I've recently been thinking about is as we recruit for the next cycle of fellows in this superintendency preparation program, one of the candidates it's a collaborative. But they discussed how they have made a decision to restructure their organization, to not just have one person at the head. That one person at the head would be a white woman over time, rising to the top of the special ed hierarchy. But rather than her staying at the top, what she's doing is relinquishing that role and intentionally creating a three-part leadership team where there is greater diversity and greater, more voices to be able to lead the organization in a more functionally, deliberately equitable way. That's an example of an attempt to redistribute leadership and to look at the fact that the nature of the ways that we create hierarchies and how we hire people, how our hiring structures are geared to hire more people just like the people who are predominant in the structure already. Those are structures that perpetuate the current hierarchies. And then when I got to my district in Framingham, I was the diversity in that office of 50 people. By the time I left, I had assistant superintendents who were Hispanic, African-American, directors of grants. I created a grants office, director of English language learners, and these were all folks of diverse backgrounds, because there, of course, there's competent people out there, but was anybody willing to go find them and to create processes that would allow them to come in? I'll be glad to sort of pass along research through our mailing list over time.
And I would just add one quick research point. In a study that we did of leadership evaluations in 37 states, we found two things. The higher you go in the hierarchy, the more ambiguous and infrequent the evaluations are. And so we set up our senior leaders for failure when we recruit them with one set of expectations and then evaluate them with a different set. And that is particularly true at the superintendent level when the evaluators are the board. So I think it's vitally important that we make evaluation part of the recruiting so people know exactly what's expected of them. And when they're signing contracts, that we coach them through that process to not just accept an evaluation to be determined 3 years later, but start at the very beginning of a relationship knowing exactly what the evaluative criteria will be. We want to set our colleagues up for success here.
So one of the questions coming into the chat is the issue of sort of evaluating the system. And so I want to talk about that, and I should jump ahead to that so that we don't lose track of time. I think the critical issue here is understanding how do we look at our systems in a way that allows us diagnostically to kind of ask the right questions. And you guys are doing great. You're asking great questions. How do we ask those right questions? How do we actually teach everybody to ask those kinds of questions? So we need to create processes that help people think on the individual level. What are my issues? How will I grow myself? And then structurally, how will I grow my system in a way that diagnostically and strategically creates action that moves the system along? So I need to be thinking about how we create the kind of assessments that are necessary. And I created this document called the Equity Progress Assessment. I was doing a project at Harvard working with the RIDES team, reimagining integration for diverse and equitable schools, RIDES. And so I created the Equity Progress Assessment as a tool for school district leadership teams in particular to think about a critical analysis of critical areas. They had 4 critical areas that they used: academics, belonging, commitment to dismantling racist structures, and diversity, ABCD. And we use that as a mechanism for doing initial audits. And it's a great tool, and it's actually open sourced on the Commons, and I could also share it with you. And I do use it I shared it in the last workshop. But I've kind of sort of wanted to take it to the next level. And so I created a next version of it, and I call it the Equity Progress Assessment 2.0, because in a sense, I want to take it to the next level. And for me, the challenge here is that the core systems are important, but also we have to get to be transformational. So I created a 5th category that simply focuses on transformation. So the first one is core strategy. You know, we want to assess the core strategy and also change what A, B, C, D also represent. So core strategy, which we know is ultimately about teaching. It's about our capacity to drive critical instruction. And also to think about, from effective culture, what does it mean for us to create a climate that's effective, that really deals with dominant cultural norms and understands them and understands the dangers and the opportunities that exist within a dominant culture, and what's being left behind potentially with other cultures within the system. So what is culture, and what does it mean to create an effective culture, and what are the steps one has to do to get there? So this is a scoring guide that essentially underlies a rubric for these categories that allows you to think them through and have conversations about these issues. So your organization, in terms of countering racist structures, has to think about what are the equitable opportunities that it wants to create, and how will it institutionalize those as a major part of the system. In terms of diversity and human capital management, what are our processes? Do we recruit and develop and manage folks with a broad sense of diversity? And if not, what's it going to take to do that? What are the ways in which we are doing it now? What are the strategies we currently use for recruitment? Where are they lacking? And what are opportunities that we might add to them? And so, as I mentioned, the 5th category, I needed to add an E to the ABCD, because ultimately it has to be about equity, and equity in terms of transformation. What are the equity efforts that we have inputs for and outcomes that are transformational? What are we monitoring that is telling us that we are in fact meeting the needs, the equity needs of our system? Are we organizationally transforming ourselves? Are we meeting the needs of all of our stakeholder groups? Are we in fact challenging ourselves to be the best that we can be? So I think that those critical categories are ones that we sometimes do not necessarily ask effectively. We don't take the question to sort of a transformational level that allows us to be able to really have good questions. So you asked before about what are some of the questions that we might ask in one of the chats. And so here's one of the tools that I use. I call this my equity alignment check tool. So in the new book that I'm putting out on equity, and the equity handbook will be coming out this summer of this year, I talk about equity alignment check because I want to sort of look at your strategies. And at every level, all these different levers, student, structural, cultural, and transformational, I want to ask, so let me see what your strategies are to manage the organization. And now let's do an equity check. Let's ask questions of to what extent is this strategy an equitable strategy? And then I want to sort of do an alignment check, which pushes to the next level and asks you to identify to what extent does that strategy support the processes, programs, and practices of systemic alignment toward equitable student outcomes. Does it connect? Does it match up to the overall intention of the system to move forward? Now, in large systems, especially if you have teams, leadership teams that are reasonably functional and you can actually process this level of questioning, you get really great results. If you can bring folks together in the varying departments of the organization and cause them to talk structurally, functionally about what needs to happen going forward, then you get some pretty extraordinary results. Now in Montgomery County, Maryland, the reason that I actually went to work there for some years is that as I came and I studied the district, I saw that they had an amazing leadership team. 25 people would get together every week, half of them school leadership staff and the other half were the departmental staff. And they would talk about how they were integrating the functions of the organization to meet whatever the critical challenge was. The question would be there, and then everyone had to speak to how they were participating in that solution. So I call that an issue of collaboration between those key people, but you also have to have integration of the structure that identifies how they are working together and organizes them so that they will have conversations together. Integration and collaboration. So in my new book, I have a whole chapter on this, which is about what in large systems you need to do to create the kind of integration structurally, the alignment of the system, so that the processes and practices actually cause people to have to answer these questions. And then what are the ways in which the people are set up to collaborate by the structure itself so that they get highly effective outcomes, which is why that system was arguably one of the most effective systems in the country coming out of the 90s and going into the early 2000s. What remains in our chat? If we I think we've exhausted all of the good questions that are in there, which is great.
I believe so. Well, just as we speak, how would you suggest helping boards of education that are very uncomfortable in discussing disrupting systemic inequities?
So from a leadership perspective, what I found that was useful as a superintendent was if I structured the strategic plan in a way that identified the critical desired outcomes for the entire system. Everybody could agree that we want to do X, Y, and Z. These are the things we really want to do. I get all my teams to buy into what do they need to do to make that effective. And if I work with those teams in the various levels, working with my principals, working with my directors to help them to think with an equity lens about what they're doing, then I can operationalize the plans that are in the district's long-range strategic plan in a way that causes everyone to be engaged in a singular focus of a plan that has an equity lens built into it because of the nature of the way in which they're being trained and the questions we're asking, the way the school improvement plans challenge them to answer those questions. And all that's about the system under the school board. Now, then the goal is to get the school board on a monthly basis to be able to have a goal that the system is working on their agenda every month. And what it does is it pushes the issues to the board and allows them to see how the district is provisioning itself to respond to those issues and causes the board it brings out the natural inclination of the board to want to do the equity work. I start off with the assumption that they want to do that work. I granted that's arguable in some cases, but I'd rather start there and then give them a structure that helps them to be able to work out the policy hygiene of having critical issues that will cause them to answer the equity questions in a systematic, not a rushed or politically challenged moment, but what is it going to take to provision this group with what they need to reach the standard? What's it going to take to cause this department to be effective? How do we support them to meet the goals we've all agreed to in our strategic plan? So I think it begins with a good systemic strategic plan, and then it cascades down the system.
I really want to support Dr. Scott's perspective on this because what I see is kind of two extremes. One extreme is happy talk. We promise we won't upset anybody. And you can't have an equity discussion with that premise. We've got to be willing to be forthcoming. And I think it really starts with leaders. And Dr. Scott is a great example of this, who is willing to be personally vulnerable before he asks other people to be vulnerable. So you really need a skilled expert facilitator like that who makes it safe to be vulnerable and safe to discuss those difficult issues. On the other hand, I think starting with a perspective that we all want what is best for children, even if we disagree on how to get there, allows safe space for disagreement and the presumption of goodwill. But that said, look, we're not going to say that everybody's going to sing kumbaya and agree with you. These are difficult conversations that require reallocation of resources and reallocation of priorities in some cases. So we pull no punches on this.
So one of the things that's in the chat is important for me to try to see if I can help tease out the conversations. The Timothy, I think, in the chat suggested that we shifted from equitable outcomes for students, the scholars that we work with, to the adults. And I really do see a real strong connection between the two. So that may have been why I naturally made that sort of natural shift. That for me, we've talked a long time about how do we set the equitable outcomes for students. And I think that we want to continue to push for that. I do hold that as the holy grail that we want to get to. But for me, and it's really in a sense at the core of my own work, is to help the adults within the system to position themselves mentally, culturally, emotionally, to kind of help those scholars to hit those challenging targets. We do have to continue to flush the system of the low expectations and the racist ideas that may permeate it. And that has to be done with good cultural analysis and problem solving and training and support. But we also have to know how to take those fundamental structures within the systems and the behaviors of the adults within them to make sure that they know what to do to make the system more effective. To the other point in the chat, checking my time as well, that it's also important that we, for those stakeholders that don't buy in, that I don't want to waste our time sort of trying to hammer it into their heads. I think we want to create processes that allow them to see that it is in their interest and in the interest of their young people to do what's right by all children. And that takes a little bit of work to sort of help people to confront either their racist ideologies or their doubt or uncertainty. Ultimately, to me, those are paradigm issues about their understandings of intellectual development that cause them to think that somehow some just may not be able to be up to snuff to make it happen. There are ways to challenge those notions. In the training that we do around managing culture, a lot of what we're trying to do is help the adults in the system understand the psychology of performance that can cause us to challenge students to reach their goals, cause adults to understand what they may be doing or thinking that causes them to think wrongly about students' development, and then help them to create structures in their lesson planning or in the leadership capacity, the leadership actions to challenge teachers to move beyond those notions so that they can in fact buy in to a more healthy society, a more healthy connectivity between what we believe and what we do for students. So I think it's possible. The challenge is to be able to create opportunities for adults to be able to come along with us. Doug, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was nodding audibly. I hope not audibly, but at least visually. Stacy, you reminded me of a line in the book that a lot of people I know have read on this call, White Fragility by D'Angelo. And there's a great line in there where she talks about racism without racists. So it is possible in these discussions to have very challenging and difficult analyses that talk about a heritage and policies that had racism at their heart without saying, and therefore you are a racist. To say we can acknowledge racism all around us and the fact that we benefited from it. And that's worth calling out. That's not the same as calling out individual people as racist. And the second part of that, I don't think advances the cause. The first part, acknowledging racism all around us, does advance the cause. I thought she made a really thoughtful distinction there.
It's very helpful. I was listening to listening to 5 minutes worth of that on the podcast, and she's so articulate. If you haven't seen that or read some of her work, it just is a helpful way to think about how to help people to sort of not feel blamed in this conversation. We need people to be able to confront the fact that in this society, we are all vulnerable to do things that are a part of the racist structures. And unless we confront that, we will never solve the problems of the society that we currently need to solve.
Well, the hour has evaporated, and Stacy, I know you could do much more on this, but actually I suppose that's the point of a webinar. You can always leave people either wishing that they had less or wishing that they had more. And I think, speaking for all of us, we wish that we had more. So I want to invite you, excuse me, you'll find more of Dr. Scott's work and background at creativeleadership.net. That's creativeleadership, all one word, .net. And you can click to get more information there, and we can put you in immediate contact with Dr. Scott and his colleagues for how you can have Making Equity work brought to your school and to your district. Dr. Scott, thank you so much for your insight today. Thanks, Tony, for your assistance on making this work, and thanks to all of you for participating today.
Thank you, Doug. My pleasure. Keep in touch, guys. Let us know how we can help you. Take care.
All right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the kind comments in the chat feature as we wrap up, and look to our website, creativeleadership.net, within 48 hours for posting of this recording. And we will email copies of the slides this afternoon once we compile those. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
Bye-bye, everybody.